Congressman from the 1st District, Steve Chabot. Steve, glad that you can join us.
It's great to be with you again, Jason. I always love coming to Waycross and discussing the issue. I think this president will be judged not by one speech, but by his record.
Sure.
And unfortunately, in my view, the record of this administration, especially on the economy and jobs, isn't a particularly good one. We still have unemployment, 8.5% approximately, and that's only the numbers that they actually count. If you look at people that are underemployed, people that used to work full-time and are now working part-time, people that have given up looking altogether, you know, it's really a lot higher than that. It's probably closer to 15% or so. And I think there was unfortunately a fair amount of divisiveness. Some call it class warfare. I prefer to call it the politics of envy and division, pitting Americans against each other. I don't think that's a productive policy for us in this country. I think we all need to be pulling in the same direction. I wish I'd have seen a little more of that at the State of the Union address, but you know, we'll see. We got some time, and hopefully the Congress and the President can work together. It might be a first, but we can try.
Returning to manufacturing, or are we beyond that and moving forward to something completely different?
Well, I think the goal's a good one. I think we do want to encourage and create more manufacturing jobs in this country. I mean, service sector jobs are fine too. We've got an awful lot of people in that sector of the economy as well. But the problem is, and my principal concern is that this administration seems to believe that more regulations, the government telling businesses how they ought to operate, putting more burdens on them, raising their taxes. You know, they would argue that people aren't paying enough taxes. I don't think that people are undertaxed or businesses are undertaxed. I think the government overspends. That's what the real problem is. That's why we have about a $15 trillion debt now. We've seen the president, even though he had said when he was first elected that his goal was to cut the deficit spending by 50%, we've seen it not go down 50%, we've seen it double. And it's unfortunate, and they're just going in the wrong direction. We need less government, lower taxes, a simplified tax code. I mean, that's what I would really like to see. I'd like to see a whole range of things happen in the tax area. I don't know how realistic it is this year. You know, you've got divided government. Sure. You've got a Republican-controlled House, you've got a Democrat-controlled Senate, and we have a Democratic president. Now, sometimes that can work. It certainly worked when President Clinton was president. You had a Republican Congress, a Democratic president, and things actually happened. We got welfare reform. We got the first balanced budget in a generation and had a budget balanced for 4 years. We haven't seen that same mindset in effect in Washington, both under this administration and under this Congress. I think the president's plan is to run against an allegedly do-nothing Congress. He's made it pretty clear that's what he wants to do. There are things that could happen in Washington to get this economy moving again, but the main thing is to get the government off the backs of these businesses and small business folks so they can create jobs like has happened for decades in this country. If you look at what's happened, and this economy has been, let's face it, pretty miserable for a number of years now. You know, we're down 2 million jobs over the past 3 years. We're in historic times now when you look at how long this recession has gone on. Some would say it's not a recession. It sure feels like a recession to most folks out there right now. This has gone on longer than any time since the Great Depression. And if you look what happened in the past, if you look under Ronald Reagan, for example, he dramatically cut taxes, 10% in 1 year, 10% the next year, 10% the following year. The economy grew. They reduced regulations. And mentioning small businesses, and the president basically ignored small businesses in this speech, unfortunately. If you look at in previous decades, 70% of the jobs that have been created across the country have not been big corporations. It's been small business entrepreneurs, people risking their own money. But right now, everybody's afraid to risk their own money, and banks aren't lending to small businesses now because what they did is they passed more regulations on the banks, so the bank regulators are looking over the bank's shoulders, so the banks won't give the money to the small business person, so they can't expand and grow and hire more people. So it's a whole cycle, and we need to reverse that. There are some tax things that we could do immediately. We could allow, for example, small business folks to take off in that current year when they buy that $100,000 or $50,000 piece of equipment, or even a few $1,000s. They buy it, they can take it off their taxes that year. When you have a piece of equipment like that, that makes the business more productive. They also have to buy it somewhere, and somebody is going to have to make it. And so those are those manufacturing jobs that you talked about. So there are some things that we could do immediately. A lot of those are dramatically cutting taxes in certain areas. What I would like to do long term is to sunset the existing tax code that we have now, so that Congress would have to go back in conjunction with whoever the president is, and simplify the whole thing. Make it a lot simpler so people don't have to spend a lot of time and energy, hire expensive attorneys and accountants to just figure out how much their taxes are. Some people think we ought to come up with either a flat tax or a flatter, simpler, easier to understand form of tax, or perhaps that we ought to throw out the income tax code altogether, get rid of the IRS, and go to a sales tax. I think either one of those are things that are worth discussing seriously compared to the tax code we have right now, which if you piled it up here today would be 8 Bibles thick, and nobody understands it, even the expensive accountants and attorneys. So that would make us a lot more efficient. Those would be some good first steps, but it also is going to take putting politics aside, maybe for a change, which is unusual in Washington, I have to admit. And the finger pointing. I mean, we're seeing it in the Republican primaries right now. I would love to see, right now the 2 top people are obviously Newt Gingrich and Mitt Romney. The 2 of them seem to be spending all their millions of dollars beating up on the other guy, rather than expressing what they're for. And I'm sure President Obama and his campaign are sitting back loving it. And I'd like to see both parties and candidates on both sides get a lot more responsible about these things and look at it, what's in the best interest of the country. And what should we be talking about that's going to get us moving in the right direction? And that's what they ought to be focused on. Well, and it's another example of what I mentioned before, when I think the president will be judged on not what he says in one speech, but what his record actually is. And his record on the Keystone Pipeline has been, unfortunately, not a good one. He said in the speech the other night, and I agreed with him on this, he said we need energy independence here in this country, that we're far too dependent on foreign sources of energy, particularly foreign oil. I agree with him there. We need an all-of-the-above strategy, meaning that we need wind, solar, biomass. We also need drilling, I would argue, in the Outer Continental Shelf, and in Alaska, and Anwar, and some other areas that right now are off limits. We ought to make the Gulf more accessible. We ought to make sure that we don't have another disaster like we had down there, but we need to do it in an environmentally safe manner. Nuclear needs to be a part of this. We shouldn't be building them on fault lines, as we saw in Japan, what can happen there recently, but it doesn't mean that we should put it off limits. So we need an all of the above strategy. But on the Keystone Pipeline, that is a key part of this strategy. We have energy now. It's not necessarily coming from our country, it's Canada. But it's coming into our country and then to the Gulf area. It's about a 1,700-mile pipeline. This has been the most studied pipeline in American history. They studied this for over 3 years. It was approved all the way up the line until it got to the administration. The administration said, no, we're not going to approve this until after the election. Then we'll take another look at it. Why is the administration doing that? Well, they got the environmentalists on one hand. I would argue in this case not just environmentalists, but radical environmentalists are saying, no, you can't do that. And then they've got labor unions and other folks who want the jobs are saying, you better move forward with this, and the president's in a dilemma, so he's punted. He's basically said, I'm not going to decide till later, after the election. We can't wait a year to get this thing up, because the Canadians have made it pretty clear. If it doesn't come to the U.S., they're going to send it out west, and it's going to end up in China, where they have much worse environmental controls than we have here. So if you care about the environment, it ain't going to do any good sending it to China. Plus we lose all the jobs and we lose the energy. So it's a very bad decision, I believe, on the administration's part to not allow this to go forward now, after it's already been studied to death. Clearly, if you are espousing energy independence, your actions ought to be consistent with that. And clearly in this case, the administration's actions are not consistent with an energy independent goal.
You can always get a hold of you in your D.C. office at 2351 Rayburn. That's in the House building there in D.C. Or you can go down to your office downtown at 441 Vine Street, Suite 3003.
Right, that's the Crew Tower.
That's the Crew Tower.
That's
so
the easiest thing.
Easy way to do it. You can go up there, find it, and it's rather easy to do. Or you can always visit your website at I believe, house.gov/Chabot.
Yeah.
And we have that there.
That's right.
So if you need any information, I know you keep your blog well attended to.